Every Sunday, before I start, I usually say something like, thank you, Jamel, and thank you, worship team, for leading us in worship today. And the danger with saying things a lot is that they sort of just become rote. But I really do mean it every time that I say that. Thank you to our worship team, and thank you for them, the time they put in during the week and the time they put in before anybody else gets here on Sunday. Thank you to our tech guys back there. Turn around and look at those tech guys back there. What a good-looking bunch. But I also want to thank you. I have a good spot right there where I can hear the whole congregation singing, and so thank you for adding your voice, and thank you for adding your heart to our time of worship. It wouldn't be the same if it was just the people up here on the platform singing. We need you to participate, and so thank you for doing that. I was reading this week, there was a big religious research poll that the results came out, and the results would probably be what you would expect within the United States. Those who identify with a particular denomination are still on the decline, as they have been for the past several years, and those who identify as none, when they check religion, are on the increase, as they have been for the past several years. But I also read a response by a religion professor who said, in meeting with and talking with and teaching those who identify as none, just because you check none on the religious poll doesn't mean that you don't have any religion. What that usually means is that you don't identify with any particular religion, but you still have some sort of faith, and still exercise that faith, and still exercise that religious action in some way. And my guess is, if there's one thing that nearly everybody does, whether they claim to be religious or not, even people who say they're not particularly religious, is that they pray. They may not pray often. They may not pray with any clear knowledge of who or what they are doing, or who they are praying to, or what they hope to accomplish by doing it. But there seems to be, unless somebody has very specifically decided that they don't believe in anything supernatural, then probably, even people that check none on the poll, probably pray. And in Luke chapter 18, Jesus gives, as we told the children, 2 short parables on prayer. And he's giving guidance to his disciples and to us on how to pray. So we'll take them each in turn. Luke chapter 18, starting with verses 1 through 8, is the first one. Now he was telling them a parable to show that at all times they ought to pray and not to lose heart, saying, there was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God and did not respect man. And there was a widow in that city, and she kept coming to him saying, give me legal protection from my opponent. And for a while he was unwilling. But afterward he said to himself, even though I do not fear God, nor respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection, lest by continually coming she wear me out. And the Lord said, hear what the unrighteous judge said. Now shall not God bring about justice for his elect, who cry to him day and night? And will he delay long over them? I tell you that he will bring about justice for them speedily. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? You don't often get the meaning ahead of the parable. Most of the time, the gospel writers just say, and Jesus told them a parable. And in fact, part of the power of the parable is that you're sort of invited into the story. And even in a short little parable like this, you can very clearly see the characters. You can very clearly feel the emotions from both characters in this. But Luke gives a helpful editorial here at the very beginning. Jesus taught them this parable for 2 reasons. He was telling them to pray at all times, and he was telling them to pray and not to lose heart. At all times and do not lose heart. And so the characters of the parable are a judge and a widow. A judge has been put in charge of upholding the law. The judge is the person who knows the law. The judge is the person whose job it is to make sure that justice is done. We're assuming here that the law and justice are the same thing. Sometimes they're not the same thing, but let's assume here, because this is a short parable, that the judge is in charge of upholding the law, which is the same thing as upholding justice. And then we get this amazing description, this judge does not fear God or respect man. Well, that's the worst person to have in that position. Does not fear God. He's not worried about eternal judgment. He doesn't respect man. He doesn't care about people. Well, then what's he doing there? How did he get that job? it's safe to assume, I think, that, and this is a parable, but we may have some inkling of what this might look like in real life. It's safe to assume that he used that position of power of upholding the law and upholding justice, and he used it to benefit himself. Maybe he just really liked people being respectful to him, even though he didn't respect them. Maybe he just really liked receiving honor when he didn't want to give honor to anybody else. Also, it probably paid well. And so he enjoyed the prestige that goes with the position of judge, even though he had no care at all about justice or about the law or about anything. And on the other hand, on the exact opposite end of the spectrum of power is a widow. Especially in the ancient world, there's a reason that the law upholds orphans and widows and immigrants, those who are aliens in the land, those who don't have power to accomplish things themselves. Or orphans and widows and the immigrant, the alien is what it says usually in the Old Testament, are those that depend on other people to be their advocates. And so this woman who is vulnerable and without power, but not entirely without power, she has a weapon that will wear down even the powerful, even the most uncaring: persistence. Verse 3, where it says, there was a widow in that city. She kept coming to him saying, my translation says, give me legal protection from my opponent. Literally, she says, do me justice. Provide me with the justice that is due to me. And we're left to imagine, this is not a super detailed parable, we're left to imagine the sort of situation that she would be in. She's vulnerable, she's powerless, and so if somebody wants to sue her, then she doesn't have an advocate. She can't afford a lawyer. If somebody wants to say, your property really belongs to me, what recourse does she have to fight that other than this judge who is supposed to uphold the law? And she doesn't think he will. Do me justice means give me the help I need. Protect me from whoever it is that's seeking to take advantage of me. And then verse 4 and 5, the judge's response, he was unwilling, but afterward he said to himself, even though I do not fear God or respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection, lest by continually coming she wear me out. Even in English, that works out pretty good. Because she's bothering me, I don't want to be worn out. Anybody who has ever had a small child or a whole room full of small children pester them about something knows what this feels like. To be constantly asked about something, to be constantly asked. Anybody who's ever been on a long trip with a person who is desperate to know, when are we going to get there? 5 minutes further down the road, when are we going to get there? And 5 minutes more down the road. Anybody who's ever been on a trip like that and been behind the wheel knows what that feels like, to be worn out. But in Greek it's actually even better, because he says, even though this widow bothers me, I will do her justice, lest by continually coming to me, she give me a black eye. So that either means, he doesn't mean it literally, he doesn't mean that this woman is going to punch him in the face. It either means that it's going to feel like he's been punched in the face because she's bothering him so much, or it means that he's going to have dark circles under his eyes, that he won't be able to sleep, he won't be able to eat, he won't be able to think about anything else because this woman keeps coming to him. So if you were making a short little movie of this parable, what you would have is this very stuck-up, proud judge going about his business, walking down the road to go to the court, and suddenly this widow pops out of the bushes and says, do me justice. He's opening a door, going into the break room at work, and she pops out from behind the door and says, do me justice. He's at his favorite restaurant, sitting down just to relax, and she's there in a wig and rips off the wig and says, do me justice. He raises the blinds in the morning for the morning light to stream in, and she's outside his window, pressed against the window, saying, do me justice. He says, I have to do something for this woman, or it's like getting hit in the face every time that I go out, because this woman is always there asking for justice. She's everywhere. She's driving me crazy. And so, out of pure selfishness, not because he has any desire to do justice, out of pure self-preservation, he ends up doing justice for this woman. By the way, this is not the point of Jesus' parable, but I think it's still safe to say that you can still expect to find from time to time the worst people in positions of power. And the answer to getting justice is still persistence. It's still keeping on seeking what is right. And the good news is we should have hope for this, because it turns out we have an ally in the pursuit of justice. The point of Jesus' parable is this: if even a godless judge like this can be moved by persistence, how much more will God do for his people? How much more will God do what his people ask in the cause of righteousness? If the worst person that you could possibly pick to be put in charge can be moved by persistence, how much more will the best person to be in charge be moved by persistence to do what is right for his people? If someone who doesn't care at all about justice can be moved by persistence, how much more will the God who loves justice, who is the source of justice, be moved to act? Jesus makes one of those statements in verse 7 and 8, that we might be tempted to water down or qualify. Now shall not God bring about his justice for his elect, who cry to him day and night, and will he delay long over them? I tell you that he will bring about justice for them speedily. We might be tempted to water this down or qualify this. But Jesus is not qualifying it at all. He will not delay. He will bring about justice speedily. And the reason we might be tempted to water this down or back up off of this very direct statement about Jesus is the question, does our experience in history, the history of the world, tempt us to argue with Jesus here? I don't know, Jesus. It seems like God delays justice sometimes. It seems like God could have been a little more speedy in places in our lives where we needed help, in places in our lives where we needed justice. That may be what Jesus' last question means. And it's interesting that Jesus ends this parable with a question. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Is Jesus asking, in spite of what may seem like you to be delay, in spite of what may seem like setbacks in the cause of justice and righteousness, in spite of those times even when it seems like God does not hear, in spite of those times when even though we're praying at all times and not losing heart, trying desperately not to lose heart when it seems like we're going to lose heart, will the Son of Man find faith on earth? I don't think that means will we believe hard enough that what we want will happen. Sometimes that's what we mean when we talk about faith. I think Jesus means, do we trust in the character of God to do what is right, to do what is right for us, even when it seems like delay, even when it seems like a setback, even when it seems like God doesn't hear? Do we still trust that God is doing what is right? Jesus gives this helpful thing at the beginning. He told them to pray so that they would pray at all times and not lose heart. And it turns out that the biggest factor to praying at all times and not losing heart is whether or not we trust in the character of God. Whether or not we trust God to do what is right. Whether or not we really trust, have faith on the earth that he desires justice for his people and that he is acting right now on behalf of it. By the way, this doesn't let us off the hook of acting, especially for the sake of justice. Jesus is not recommending here that we just pray for what is just and what is right and let God take care of it. Frederick Douglass was a former slave before the Civil War and escaped from slavery and then became one of the most powerful abolitionist voices in American history. And he said once about praying for freedom, I prayed for 20 years, but received no answer until I prayed with my legs. Sometimes you see that quote used as ammunition by anti-faith people. See, doesn't make any difference to pray, you have to do it yourself. That's a serious misunderstanding of Frederick Douglass, who was a Christian and a very devout Christian. Frederick Douglass didn't mean that God didn't help him. He meant that God helped him when he acted. When he took that step to act, God was there and was helping him. It turns out there were other believers who put themselves on the line to help Frederick Douglass escape from slavery and become free. Douglass escaped, by the way. He doesn't write about this when he wrote this he wrote several biographies. This was in his first biography. He didn't explain how he got away because he didn't want the people that were trying to stop slaves from escaping to figure it out. But here's how he did it. Somebody got him a U.S. Navy uniform, and he dressed up as a U.S. Navy officer, used forged identification, and then took a train from Baltimore, which was in Maryland, a slave state, to New York City. But he didn't do all that himself. His fiancée got him the uniform, and then met him in New York City, and they got married. Abolitionists in New York City got him the forged identification and met him when he got off the train, gave him a place to stay, gave him a place to live, helped him find a job until he could become a free person on his own. This is not a different thing than God answering his prayer to be free. It was God answering his prayer when he and others who were united to do what was right and to do justice acted to do it. But it's not separate from God doing it. God did it through him, and God did it through them. A lot of things had to go right in that plan for Frederick Douglass to get from slavery to freedom. And I think God was involved in all of them. But for us, so it doesn't let us off the hook to say that God is going to act in the cause of justice. We have to participate in that. We are called to do justly and love mercy and walk humbly with our God. But what gives us the power to even act, as well as the power to pray, is to trust in the character of God. He desires justice, and he will speedily bring it about. He desires us to be working for the same things that he desires, and he promises us that he will bring it about. So the question for us, Jesus' question at the end of this parable is, will the Son of Man find us believing that and acting on that when he returns? The second parable shifts and is about another angle on prayer. The first was concerned about our trust in God's character, and the second one is about our character. Look at Luke chapter 18, starting in verse 9. He also told this parable to certain ones who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax gatherer. The Pharisee stood and was praying thus to himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get. But the tax gatherer, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified, rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself shall be humbled, but he who humbles himself shall be exalted. The point of this is pretty clear. But again, I like dwelling on the details for a minute. The first thing to do with this parable is to try and recapture the element of surprise that we miss as 21st century hearers, that first century hearers would have been rocked back a little bit. We are used to, if we've been around church at all, or ever heard the parable of the Good Samaritan, we're used to thinking of Pharisees as the bad guys. Where we know that Jesus argued with the Pharisees. We know that the Pharisees were opposed to him, and so we're used to thinking of them as the villain of the story. The people in the first century would not have been used to thinking of Pharisees in that way. If you were looking for somebody who did what God wanted them to do, the first place you would look would be the Pharisees. Because these were the people that were experts in the law, and they did it. And they got pretty mad at other people that didn't do it. And in fact, that, it turns out, is where Jesus' conflict with the Pharisees comes in. Paul, the Apostle Paul, pretty proudly proclaimed himself a Pharisee at one time in his life. He was a keeper of the law, and that's what he was concerned about. In fact, that's why Paul persecuted Christians, because he thought they were lawbreakers. So it would have been a surprise to first century people to hear a Pharisee went up to the temple and didn't go down from the temple justified, declared not guilty. If you were looking for somebody who wasn't guilty, the Pharisees would be the first place you would start. And if you were looking for somebody that God was going to declare not guilty, the tax gatherer would be the pretty much last person you'd look at. Not just because they had that same sort of feeling of irritation that we might feel toward the IRS. The tax gatherers had made a decision. Israel was part of the Roman Empire. The tax gatherers were Jewish people that worked for the Romans, taking money from Jewish people and giving it to the Romans. So these were people who had made a decision against their own people. They had made a decision to work for the big dogs and to take advantage of their own people. And they got a little cut on the side too. So they were thieves as well as betrayers. So that's why people didn't like tax collectors. These were people who had made a choice about where they stood, and they were seen as betrayers and traitors of their own people and traitors of God. And so the last person that you would expect to be declared not guilty by God the judge would be the tax gatherer. The hearers would have expected the exact reverse of what Jesus says happens in this parable. To update it, it depends. Who do you think the best of? Let's assume it's the pastor for a second. So, so a pastor and a prostitute go to church to pray. And the pastor looks around and says, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, all these other people, even like this prostitute. And the prostitute says, God, I'm not worthy of anything, but I need your mercy. And one of them goes home justified, and one of them goes home not justified. Pharisees and tax collectors not only were religious opposites, but they were also political opposites. The Pharisees really believed in Israel, and they wanted Israel to rise and be the power in the world. The tax gatherers they worked officially for the Roman Empire. So you could update that politically as well. Whatever your favorite a member of your favorite political party went to church alongside a member of your least favorite political party, and one of them did this and one of them did that. I'm not going to tell you which is your favorite political party and which one is not. You know very well. But just imagine that the one that you would least expect to be justified becomes justified because they ask for mercy and don't just assume that they have all the answers and don't just assume that they're right before God. So let's break down these prayers. And I love this, the Pharisees' prayer. God, I thank you. So far, so good. This is a good prayer so far. God, I thank you that I am not like other people. Oh, man. Just dove off a cliff. God, I thank you that I'm not like other people. And then he starts listing them. I thank you that I am not like these kinds of people. Swindlers. People that steal money from other people. Unjust. People that don't care about your justice. Adulterers. Those sleep-arounders. And this tax gatherer, like that guy. I thank you, God, that I am not like that guy. And this is the best part. The Pharisee gives God his resume. It's not a good idea to give people your resume unless they specifically ask for it. It makes you seem a little, I don't know, proud, prideful. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get. There are many postures for prayer. None of them is the right posture for prayer. The typical Jewish posture for prayer was to stand, as this Pharisee is standing, with hands raised toward heaven. This is not a posture of prayer, though. That was the Pharisee's posture of prayer. The good old patting himself on the back. That doesn't work as a posture of prayer because then it's all about you. And it's not really even about God at all. God is supposed to be the audience of this Pharisee's self-congratulation. And that doesn't really work as prayer. That's not the sort of prayer that God is going to hear. His prayer posture is patting himself on the back, and a very important part of his prayer is comparing himself to others. That's where it really goes off the cliff. When we start comparing ourselves against others, that is a good sign that we have missed the point of what it is that we're supposed to be doing in our relationship with God. This is a personal question, and I'm not going to ask for any testimony, but I want you to think about it. What goes through your mind when you've been speeding and you see the lights flash in your rearview mirror? What goes through your mind? Was it, I deserve this. Justice has been done. I was, in fact, exceeding the speed limit. It was my foolish choice to do this, and so I deserve this ticket. Maybe, if that goes through your mind, maybe you are a perfect person and in need of no correction. But my guess is that the first thing that you might be thinking about is all the people who passed you before the lights turned on. You should immediately start comparing yourself to other people. What happened to that big truck that was tailgating me when I was going 10 miles over the speed limit? And I was thinking to myself, what do you want from me? I'm going 10 miles over. Get off my tail. What about that guy? When is he going to get his justice? Does that go through your mind? Do the reasons that you were speeding go through your mind? I have a right to do this. Well, the speed limit is not a suggestion. It's the law. So they're well within their rights to pull you over. But when we start comparing ourselves against others, that's when we've gone off the rails and that's when we've missed the point. It's not about justice anymore. It's not about what's right. It's about what I want. It's about me. I should be different. A special exception should be made for me. We want to be judged by a different standard. The standard is there posted on the side of the highway, but I would prefer to be judged by a different standard, one that I make up myself. And so the reason we compare ourselves to other people is I would like to be judged by a different standard than God's standard. God told me to love the Lord my God with all my heart and soul and mind and strength and love my neighbor as myself. And I'm not very good at that, and so I prefer to compare myself to people that are even worse at it than me. I want to be judged by a different standard than God's standard. Verse 9, he told this parable to certain ones that trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. That's a necessary part of pride. You can't be proud unless you've elevated yourself above somebody else. My favorite one-sentence explanation of how the Pharisees thought about people is in the Gospel of John. The Pharisees send some people to arrest Jesus. There's a big crowd around them. Jesus says some impressive things, and they come back without arresting him. The Pharisees say, "Where's the guy we sent you to arrest?" And they start telling the story about what Jesus said and about how the crowd reacted. And they say, "This ignorant crowd is accursed. These idiots are all going to hell," is what that means. This ignorant crowd is accursed. That's how the Pharisees thought about people who didn't keep the law. These idiots are going to hell. And they didn't care about them. And that's why this Pharisee doesn't go home justified. Is because that heart that says, these idiots are going to hell, is very different than God's heart. Jesus, when he saw probably some of the same group of people who had followed him out into the wilderness without any lunch, without thinking ahead, said they were lost, like sheep without a shepherd. That's a very different sort of perception of those who are lost than, these idiots are going to hell. This ignorant crowd is accursed. And that was the source of Jesus' clash with the Pharisees. The heart of God versus the heart that was self-congratulatory. One, the tax collector, gets justification, gets the gavel brought down by God and say, not guilty, because of his honest humility. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. There's a prayer that's ancient. Ancient Christians used to do this, called the breath prayer. If you've ever looked into relaxation techniques, this is not exactly a relaxation technique, but it's a prayer. It does help you relax though. To breathe in and think, Jesus Christ. To breathe out and say, Son of God. To breathe in and say, have mercy on me. To breathe out and say, a sinner. And to repeat that, Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. It's a reminder of who God is and who we are. And it also helps us breathe that spirit in and breathe out that spirit that we don't want. This is honest humility. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. He's not looking at the Pharisee. He's not looking at anybody except God. And he knows what he needs from God. He needs mercy. Mercy is when you don't get what you deserve. He knows what he deserves from God. He's a traitor to God. He's a traitor to his people. He's a thief. He knows what he deserves, but he's asking for mercy. And he goes back to his house justified, declared not guilty, because of his honest humility. There is such a thing as dishonest humility that puts on the mask of humility, but it's not really about humility. That's not this. This is honest humility. Just a man examining himself before God and finding out exactly where he lacks and asking God for exactly what he needs. Jesus' guide to prayer asks us to hold two things together at the same time. It asks us to fully trust in God's character. And it asks us to have a healthy doubt of our own character, a healthy doubt of our ability to be righteous, and a full trust in God's ability to be righteous. Because we need both. We need God's justice and we need God's mercy. I don't think it's a coincidence that the first story is about God's justice, about God doing what is right. And the second story is about asking for mercy. When those of us who have not done right realize it and realize we need his mercy. But we need both. We need both in this world, and we need both in our lives. We need his justice and his mercy. And so, to pray at all times, to not lose heart, and not to trust in ourselves to be righteous. We need two things. The bold confidence to ask for justice, and the honest reckoning to ask for mercy. And so holding those two things together. And I love that about Christianity, that Christianity, sometimes it's about finding a middle way between two things, but sometimes it's about holding both poles of power and just letting the electricity surge through you. This is one of those times when you hold on to both things fiercely. God, I am boldly confident to come to your throne. Let's go. Let's go to the throne. That's where we belong. We are children of God. Let us boldly go to the throne of grace and ask him for what we need. Hold on to that pole and let that electricity surge through you. But also, realize, have mercy on me, a sinner. I don't deserve that. That's a privilege that is offered to me out of mercy, to ask for the justice of God. But it's not what I deserve. What I deserve is condemnation. But instead, he gives me grace. Instead, he gives me life. Instead, he welcomes me and invites me in. And holding on to both things, let that power be the power that guides our prayer. As you came this morning, you may be in one spot or the other. You may feel one more strongly than the other. There's something in your life that you or someone else in your life needs. You need the justice of God. You need the righteousness of God. There's somebody that you've been praying for a long time, and you need what is right and good to happen in their life. And you've been tempted to doubt that God will ever come through. Hold on. Don't lose heart. Hold on to that. You may be very clearly here to say, God, I know I'm a sinner. I have no expectation that you're going to hear me. And to that, listen to Jesus and say, no, expect that if you come to God honestly and honestly evaluating who you are before him, You can do both. You can ask for mercy and you can ask for justice. Because the character of God is big enough to take on both. Is big enough to welcome us in when we ask for both things. God, I need your mercy. God, I need your justice. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for who you are. Thank you that you're big enough, God, that you're good enough, that you're great enough, that you love us enough to do what is just, to do what is right, and to give mercy to those who need it, to those who humbly ask. Heavenly Father, I pray for any here that have been standing on the outskirts, have been standing on the outside, God, and wondering if there's a place for them with you. And I pray, God, that your Spirit would draw them to you and let them know that you are their home, that you belong, that they belong at your throne. Heavenly Father, for those who have been here and have been praying a long time for justice, God, for what is right, for what they need, I pray, God, that you would confirm in them today, God, that you hear them, that you are acting to do what is good, to do what is right, to bring about what is needed in their lives and in the lives of those they love. Heavenly Father, help us to hang on to both things, your justice, your mercy, because of how great you are. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.